HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Wealth of a Nation, A History of Trade Politics in America, by C. Donald Johnson. Read by David Stifel. Preface. As the seasons change from summer to fall from the vantage point of my office on our family farm in rural North Georgia, I'm struck by the tumult and turbulence the world is facing in the early months of the Trump era. In this particular setting, in an old house that has seen so many seasons of American history since before the Civil War, surrounded by old trees outside and even older books inside, and at this particular moment, with the liberal geopolitical and economic institutions created to avoid another depression and the world wars of the 20th century, facing perhaps the greatest existential threats since they were created, I review the final edits of the manuscript for this book, taking the long view of the politics of trade in America. Centuries before President Donald Trump withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and other international leadership roles, while promising to build a big, beautiful wall. Indeed, centuries before Adam Smith wrote the seminal treatise that is the foundational reference for this book, there was another great global power that chose to withdraw from engagement with the world and its markets, and to retire behind a great wall. Since I began traveling to East Asia as a trade negotiator in the late 1990s and began reading Chinese history, one of the more fascinating periods that I have come across, a period that has particular relevance to the politics of trade today, takes place during the reign of Zhu Di, who became Yongle, the third emperor of the Ming dynasty in 1402. Zhu Di moved the capital to Beijing from Nanjing and expanded the sphere of Chinese culture and influence far beyond its territories. He repaired and reopened the 2,000-mile Grand Canal to transport grain from the fertile Yangtze River Valley in the south to Beijing, and built majestic monuments known to most tourists visiting China today, including the Imperial Palace of the Forbidden City and the Temple of Heaven, and he established the Ming tombs with his own. Zhu Di personally led 5 successful military campaigns north of the Great Wall against the Mongols, who had ruled China for the century preceding Ming rule under the Yuan dynasty, beginning under Kublai Khan. Zhu Di fought the Mongols his entire life, as they continued to be the greatest threat to Ming rule. Although Zhu Di's tactics were often ruthless, his reign is considered one of the most brilliant in Chinese history. One of the premier achievements of the reign of Emperor Yongle was the expansion of the Ming naval fleet under the Admiral Zheng He and the historic maritime empire created through Zheng's expeditions. Zheng He was the son of a devout Muslim of Mongol extraction who fought with Mongol rebels against the Ming army and was killed in battle. The Ming soldiers captured the 10-year-old Zheng, castrated him, and gave him as a servant to Zhu Di, a prince and prominent young army officer at the time. Though during the reigns of Zhu Di's predecessors, eunuchs were not trusted with political or significant administrative assignments, Zheng became a valued advisor and confidant to Zhu Di throughout his military campaigns, including the rebellion Zhu Di led to take the throne from his nephew not long after the death of Zhu Di's father, Emperor Hongwu. Shortly after becoming emperor, Zhu Di placed Zheng in charge of his naval fleet. Chinese vessels and sea charts had led the world for several centuries, but Zheng He expanded the capacity and reach of China's navy exponentially. His lead ships, called treasure ships, were estimated to be between 400 and 600 feet long and over 150 feet wide, at least 5 times the size of the vessels sailed by Christopher Columbus 90 years later. Each of these ships, which numbered more than 60 on the first voyage with 9 masts and 12 sails, carried at least 500 sailors and treasures of Chinese porcelain, silk goods, iron implements, and silver coins. The entire fleet of over 300 assorted ships carried horses, weaponry, grain, and a crew of around 28,000 men. From 1405 to 1433, Zheng led 7 voyages, lasting 2 years each, to more than 30 countries throughout Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. His plan under Zhu Di's direction was to chart the entire world, carrying thousands of tons of treasure and a military force to promote the power and influence of the Ming dynasty and build a great empire through gifts, trade, and foreign domination. Using his military and diplomatic skills, Zheng founded numerous colonies during these voyages and brought many of the kingdoms he visited within the Chinese tribute system. Zheng spread Chinese culture and influence throughout the regions he traveled, which can be traced centuries after his expeditions ended, and temples were constructed in his honor. After Zhu Di died in 1424 from an illness acquired during his last expedition against the Mongols, however, the imperial power and influence of the Chinese navy soon came to an end. The 2 succeeding emperors found Zheng's expeditions too extravagant at a time when Mongols continued to be the greatest threat to the dynasty. Unlike Zhu Di and Zheng He, they saw little value in interaction with the outside world. Zhu Di's grandson, Emperor Suand, permitted only one last voyage, during which Zheng traveled to Mecca and died at sea on the return home. From this time forward, the dynasty allowed its ocean-going vessels to deteriorate without repair, and withdrew behind the Great Wall in the grand sanctity of the Middle Kingdom. The kingdom closed its ports to foreign ships, which the powers believed only carried barbarians, in xenophobic resistance to the outside world. This policy continued into the Qing dynasty, and ultimately led to disastrous and humiliating consequences in the last century of the empire and beyond. The Opium Wars, the territorial concessions taken by the Western powers, and the ravaging abuses inflicted by Japanese militarism have all instilled a lasting national resentment that impacts Chinese policy to this day. The current leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, who has become the most powerful Chinese ruler at least since Deng Xiaoping, invoked the slogan, "The Chinese Dream," as the guiding creed for his regime, soon after he became president of the People's Republic of China in 2012. At first, many observers likened the phrase to a meaning similar to the American dream of individual economic prosperity, especially in view of the rising wealth of China, as much of its population emerged from poverty under the economic reforms implemented during Deng's rule. But Xi's use of the slogan offered a much broader theme. The dream he proposed was a nationalistic call for a great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Frankly, the message sounds something like a call very similar to one that we often see on baseball caps in America. Make China great again, but with a true reference point to a time when China really was the single most powerful nation on earth. President Xi cited the Chinese dream for a national rejuvenation in a speech given at the National Museum of China, commending an exhibition called Road to Revival, which juxtaposed the achievements of ancient imperial China in a permanent exhibit, against the spectacle of national humiliation that followed the penetration of European imperialists into the isolated Middle Kingdom, and ended with the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1931 to 1945. The exhibition presented a sanitized version of the progress made since the communist liberation of China in 1949, on the road to the current socialist market economy, or what Deng Xiaoping called socialism with Chinese characteristics. Of course, the exhibits gave no hint of the 1989 massacre that occurred in front of the museum on Tiananmen Square, downplayed the chaotic destruction of the Cultural Revolution, and largely ignored China's other self-inflicted disasters occurring during the rule of the charismatic Mao Zedong. It was against this backdrop that Xi urged national unity in the effort to revive the pride and greatness of China. The legacy of the eunuch Admiral Zheng He's maritime exploits was almost lost when, after his death, the Mandarin elites, who were competing with the eunuchs for important ranks in the imperial court, destroyed most of the records of his voyages and diplomatic accomplishments. Yet as the new Chinese Republic began building a navy to defend against the imperial Japanese incursions in the early 20th century, the memory of Zheng's powerful navy was revived for a time. More recently, in the present century, his diplomatic successes are being honored by recalling his exploits as a national hero and by imitation, especially in the use of soft power to extend Chinese influence. As China has risen to become the second-largest economy in the world behind the United States, it has taken its modern version of treasure ships abroad to welcoming countries and invested in infrastructure and established trade relationships. I spent 8 summers teaching American and Chinese law students at Tsinghua University Law School in Beijing a course on U.S.-China trade issues under the WTO, which included seminars with the Chinese Ministry of Commerce and the American Embassy in Beijing, hearing each complain about the other's trade violations. One thing that my students learned from this experience, if nothing else, is that the rules-based liberal trade system now embodied in the World Trade Organization is critical to the economic stability vital to the national interests of these two economic powers. It may even help them become great again. As an American who has been involved with trade policy as a congressional staffer, practitioner, policymaker, negotiator, and academic for over 4 decades, I freely admit to being a partisan for the liberal economic institutions that the generation of our fathers and grandfathers created. Their effort was the culmination of a struggle that began at the time Adam Smith published An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Smith's seminal treatise declared itself to the world in the same year that our founding fathers declared the existence of the United States of America. The world-changing history that followed 1776, I believe, is no coincidence. While we owe a multitude of different factors for our growth as the most powerful and prosperous nation in world history, certainly one of the most influential is that we have led the world in applying the liberal insights of both Adam Smith and our own founders in structures and institutions that support broad prosperity, particularly for the working class. This book tells the practical political story of how that happened, in all its fits and starts. Today, the United States and most societies of the world are in a period of profound technological, economic, social, and political transition that threatens to undermine the liberal economic order that we created. Indeed, threatens to undermine liberalism itself. The wealth of our nation depends on whether we can learn a new lesson from our own history. Don Johnson, Royston, Georgia, September 2017. Introduction. The Battle in Seattle and Adam Smith. Political economy, considered as a branch of the science of a statesman or legislator, proposes 2 distinct objects: to enrich both the people and the sovereign, to promote the little interest of one little order of men in one country. It hurts the interest of all other orders of men in that country, and of all men in all other countries. Adam Smith. The idea for this book came to me on a rainy day in Seattle at the end of November 1999, as 40,000 anti-globalization protesters effectively trapped me and the other delegates representing 134 different countries inside our hotels blocking our participation in a ministerial meeting of the World Trade Organization, WTO. The demonstrators were a colorful lot, dressed non-threateningly as sea turtles, butterflies, dolphins, trees, and vegetables, as they took to the streets determined to shut down the wicked activities in which they presumed we were engaged. Many of the foreign delegates stared in puzzled amusement, and later bemused annoyance, as they seemed to be trying to figure out the connection between the costumes and the issues that they, the delegates themselves, were there to negotiate. In most cases, there was some trade-based connection to the protests, but the event attracted many of society's discontents who just seemed to be longing for an opportunity to bring back the 1960s. There were, to name a few among the oddly allied opponents, the vegan dykes, marching topless along with electrical workers, right-wing militiamen, anti-nuclear activists, communists, Free Burma and Free Tibet demonstrators, the Bicycle Alliance of Washington, and defenders of the long-deceased singer-actor-activist Paul Robeson and Mumia Abu-Jamal, a former journalist and Black Panther on death row in Philadelphia for killing a policeman in 1981. It has sort of become a grab bag of people unhappy with capitalism, a little bit carnival-like, admitted Mike Dolan, a field director for Global Trade Watch, one of the principal organizers of the demonstrations. A message scribbled on a store window attempted to sum up their collective message. I don't know what a WTO is, but I fucking hate rich people. This broad message, which, along with countless more focused ones, had been promoted effectively by the myriad of protest organizers on the World Wide Web of free market technology, had a broad international following. There were complimentary outbursts of the protest as far away as London and Manila, and in more remote and unlikely corners of the world, such as Nashville, Tennessee, at the presidential campaign headquarters of Vice President Al Gore. In Seattle, there were strong protest contingents from all parts of Latin America, Asia, and Europe. The most prominent of the foreign participants was José Bové, the French sheep farmer and activist who was protesting the retaliatory 100% U.S. tariffs imposed on his Roquefort cheese after the European Union refused to comply with a WTO decision against a ban on American hormone-treated beef. Bové spent much of his early childhood in America, while his parents studied at the University of California, Berkeley. He became an international celebrity and a national hero in France for bulldozing a McDonald's restaurant under construction in a French city only a few months before coming to Seattle. His contribution to the protest came in the form of serving 484 pounds of Roquefort cheese, along with French baguettes and Bordeaux wine, in front of a McDonald's while denouncing la malbouffe, the lousy food of the WTO, as he called it, under a sign reading, "Resist McDonaldization." If there had been a mascot to symbolize the Seattle demonstrations, it no doubt would have been the turtle. It was certainly the predominant costume of the environmental protesters. Appearing like an invasion of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, an estimated 250 of the cardboard amphibians pranced through Seattle with signs reading, "Free trade equals Dead Sea Turtles." If overwrought for rhetorical impact, they at least had a complaint connected to the WTO. In 1998, the WTO ruled that certain U.S. regulations banning the importation of shrimp from countries that did not require the use of turtle protection devices were inconsistent with WTO obligations. Based upon this decision, Patricia Forkin, the director of the U.S. Humane Society, charged, "The road to Seattle is littered with sea turtle carcasses." An objective review of this decision, however, leads to a less dramatic conclusion. The U.S. law upon which the regulation was based had two principal objectives. The law fostered the environmentalist objective of forcing governments to adopt stronger protections for the endangered sea turtles. It was also designed to equalize the costs of operation between U.S. fishermen who were required to use turtle excluder devices in their trawling nets and their foreign competitors. The Louisiana senators sponsoring the legislation readily acknowledged that they did so to help our shrimpers in Louisiana. A large number of shrimp exporting countries saw it as a discriminatory protectionist measure and initiated the case against the United States in the WTO dispute settlement system. Supported by briefs filed by 11 international environmental organizations, the United States argued that its shrimp turtle restrictions were sanctioned under Article 20 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. This provision permits trade restrictions that are necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health, or relate to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources if they are not arbitrary or discriminatory, nor simply a disguised restriction on international trade. At the first stage of the dispute settlement process, a WTO panel refused even to consider the amicus curiae briefs of the environmental groups and summarily rejected the American defense of its measures under Article 20. The panel concluded that the restrictions were a clear threat to the multilateral trading system. If the panel decision had prevailed on appeal, the environmentalists' protest in Seattle would have been on firmer ground. However, the decision of the appellate body was far more balanced. In the first place, it said the panel should have considered the briefs filed by the environmental organizations and sharply criticized the panel's excessive reach in extending a categorical superiority to its view of the purpose of the WTO obligations. That is, to develop a durable multilateral trading system which the U.S. shrimp turtle measure was undermining. Importantly, the appellate body found that the U.S. measures were in fact related to the protection of exhaustible natural resources, and therefore within the purview of Article 20. It was in the application of these measures that it found fault with the U.S. position. Essentially, it held that the manner in which the measure was being implemented was arbitrary and discriminatory in its application to the WTO member states. The final WTO decision did not attempt to overturn the basic restriction, which the ruling found to have sufficient inherent flexibility to be enforced consistently with WTO obligations. Indeed, well before the Seattle Ministerial, the United States accepted the decision without changing the underlying law, and simply revised its regulatory guidelines so as to continue requiring foreign shrimpers to use turtle-excluding devices in order to export to the American market. As in most cases with balanced decisions, however, neither the advocacy groups nor the complaining countries were pleased. The Earth Island Institute, the principal environmental group behind the broad application of the restrictions, called it a death blow for sea turtles, while the complaining foreign countries decried it as dangerous, predicting that it will result in explosive growth in unilateral, discriminatory, trade-related environmental measures. While the turtle may have become the symbol of the protest, the clear leader of its mobilization was the American labor movement. The most widely perceived victim, and correspondingly the most attractive underdog of trade liberalization, is the American worker. It is a perception that has created a formidable bond among the vast majority of those associated with the blue-collar job market, union and non-union alike. This bond is not limited to workers impacted by trade, such as those in textile and steel jobs. Counterintuitively, it even includes workers whose jobs depend on trade for survival. The local Seattle Machinists Union at Boeing, the nation's largest exporter, deriving nearly half its revenues from foreign sales, supplied 900 marshals for the Seattle protest. An estimated 9,600 dock workers from the International Longshore and Warehouse Union took part in the protest by temporarily shutting down not only the Seattle port, but dozens of others all along the West Coast, including the country's largest in Los Angeles and Long Beach, California. Viewing the WTO as the pinnacle of the corporate-dominated world marketplace created by the corporations, of the corporations, and for the corporations, in the words of the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, AFL-CIO President John Sweeney, tens of thousands of workers converged upon Seattle, demanding to be heard. According to a handout distributed by the AFL-CIO, Fast Facts on Mobilization, union members were to arrive from more than 50 unions, 25 states, and 144 countries in car caravans, more than 185 buses, 9 planes, and 2 trains. On the conference's scheduled start date, November 30th, the protesters ruled. The front line surrounded the convention hall with little or no interference by Seattle police. Most of the officials in the trade delegations were pinned in their hotels for much of the day, afraid or unable to venture out. The opening ceremonies were canceled, and any trade negotiations that took place were carried on in hotel rooms and by telephone. In the largest labor protest in American history, 25,000 trade unionists joined forces with at least 10,000 environmentalists and other assorted protesters to take over the streets of Seattle in a rain-soaked march and rally with thunderous anti-trade speeches from the all-star luminaries of American labor. J. Mazur, president of the Union of Needle Trades Industrial and Textile Employees, UNITE, declared, "The rules of this new global economy have been rigged against workers, and we're not going to play by them anymore." United Steelworkers President George Becker promised to lead an effort that would force the U.S. Congress to abandon the WTO. "Either they fix the goddamn thing," he said, "or we're going to get out." Teamsters President James P. Jimmy Hoffa declared, "We want the message to go out that the WTO is in trouble. The citizens are re-voting," and proclaimed the event the beginning of a worldwide revolt against corporate greed. By late afternoon, the largely peaceful labor protest was followed by a rash of violent acts by a small contingent of anarchists wearing black clothing, masks, and in some cases, Nike sneakers. The anarchists ran through the streets, smashing windows and spray-painting graffiti on the downtown retail outlets of establishments they considered to be the culprits of trade evils: Nike Town, Starbucks, The Gap, and a McDonald's restaurant that had been the site of José Bové's protest earlier in the day. As bonfires of trash and police barricades were being ignited on the street corners, the Seattle police, with full riot gear, finally moved in and shut down the protest with tear gas, rubber bullets, and pepper spray, creating the frightful appearance of an urban war zone in a week that came to be known as the Battle in Seattle. A Hollywood film of the same name, starring Charlize Theron and Woody Harrelson, later celebrated the triumph of the protest over the alleged nefarious intentions of the WTO. The first reaction to the demonstrations from free trade proponents was sublime disdain. The popular liberal economist Paul Krugman offered this explanation of the urban legend spurring the anticipated protests in the internet publication Slate the week before they began. "The WTO has become to leftist mythology what the United Nations is to the militia movement, the center of a global conspiracy against all that is good and decent." According to the myth, the ultra-secretive WTO has become a sort of super-governmental body that forces nations to bow to the wishes of multinational corporations. It destroys local cultures. It despoils the environment. And it rides roughshod over democracy, forcing governments to remove laws that conflict with its sinister purposes.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?